France in support of economic refugees as part of the NGO Action contre la faim. He has worked in numerous emergencies across the globe for the Emergency and Rehabilitation Division of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. And as mentioned before, my name is Laurie Heber-Girardet. I am the Chief of OCHA's Intercluster Coordination Section in the Program Support Branch of OCHA Geneva. So maybe just a few words before we begin about those of you who have joined us as participants. We have got about 20 participants from Africa, another 10 from Asia, almost 40 from North America, and another 20 from the Middle East. So looking forward to a lively discussion and debate, albeit it'll be via text messages. We will do our best to really make sure that your questions are put to the panelists. Before we get into the substance, I think it would probably be useful if we just reminded ourselves what is meant to be the function of a humanitarian country team, and how does that differ from an intercluster coordination group. So the humanitarian country team, led by the humanitarian coordinator, is the overall strategic and operational decision-making function in a country. It has an oversight for how the operations actually are rolled out in a humanitarian context. It's led by the HC, and the composition includes representatives from the UN, from IOM, international NGOs, the Red Cross, the Red Crescent movements. And the agencies that are designated as cluster leads should also represent the clusters as well as their respective organizations on the HCT. The Intercluster Coordination Group is sometimes referred to as the engine room in humanitarian operations. They are not responsible for strategy, but they are responsible for the operations that make the strategy work. And probably it would be useful to remind ourselves of the core functions of the clusters, which includes supporting service delivery by providing a platform that ensures service delivery is driven by the strategic response plan and strategic priorities. The clusters and the interclusters are meant to inform the HC and the HCT strategic decision making by preparing needs assessment, analysis of gaps as well. They also are responsible for developing sectoral plans. They monitor and evaluate performance, and they build national capacity and preparedness and contingency planning. And they also have a role to play in advocacy. So since it's fairly clear what the HCT is supposed to be doing and what is the membership of the HCT and the roles and responsibility of the clusters, the question is, why isn't it working as it should work in the field? Why are we seeing in all of our operational peer reviews and in lessons learned a concern over a gap and a lack of appropriate linkages between the HCT and the Intercluster Coordination Group? I would like to start off today's discussion by going to Afghanistan and asking Mark Bowden, who is the humanitarian coordinator in that country, to tell us what happens when these linkages break down, and what is it that can be done to repair them to ensure that these two groups are working effectively together in support of effective humanitarian operations. So over to you, Mark, please.
Thanks, Laurie. And first, I'd just like to say that when the linkages break down between them, I think one of the major problems we've faced here is that the clusters and the HCT function at a far lower level, that they basically become information sharing tools rather than actually, in the case of the clusters, fulfill their role in standard setting or setting a direction for the work of the clusters. I mean, we've also seen here, sort of in practical terms, this has an impact more recently in the quality of the debate on shelter and the standards that are applied to the provision of shelter for flood victims. So also we've had issues around the development of the appropriate tools being used in the clusters. For example, on the food security cluster, we've gone through a major debate over the better management and use of the IPC and interpretation of the IPC. So essentially, I think when the structures aren't working properly, the processes aren't working properly, what you get is a decline to a sort of lowest common denominator of comfort for everybody, which tends to be, in terms of their work, a focus on information sharing, and in terms of resource allocation, strategic development, just a sense of fair division, either of work or of resources, rather than a more strategic approach. So, you know, my sense of what is needed in this case is both a restructuring of the, as we've done in Afghanistan, of the HCT, to actually develop that and empower the HCT to be a decision-making body, but also to create a structure where the clusters have a level of accountability to the HCT, and so it's not just a reporting function, but the HCT takes responsibility for working together with the HC in setting a strategic direction for humanitarian action, and the clusters are actually involved in delivering that at a level of quality that is ensured by high levels of accountability to the HCT. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that, Mark. Now, I should let participants know that Mark will have to be leaving us after the first half hour because he has another engagement, and he will then be replaced by Kathy Howard, who is the acting head of OCHA in Afghanistan, who has worked previously in South Sudan and has quite a lot of experience working with the Intercluster Coordination Group. But before you go, Mark, I would be really appreciative if you could walk us through how you are undertaking reform in Afghanistan so that these linkages between the HCT and the intercluster can be better established in an effort to be more accountable to the people that we're trying to help in Afghanistan. Please.
Yes, okay, well, the challenge we've been facing, and it's taken us, I suppose, something like 2 years to manage the reform process, is there was a certain the HCT had become very large and very unwieldy. We had major attendance not just from broad sections of the NGO, UN, and donor community, and as a result of which the HCT, as I said, focused more on information sharing. One of the first tasks was to try and streamline the HCT as a means of basically giving them more authority and more power, but we met some obstacles along the way, resistance primarily, interestingly, from the donors, because they were, in a sense, locked down in Kabul, saw the HCT as the only opportunity to get information and to get a better engagement with the humanitarian community. So we also had to provide an alternative to the donors and to manage the donor sort of engagement with the HCT more effectively. On the NGO side, we again are in a country which has 1,200 NGOs with all the problems of coordination, delegation, speaking with, and the delegation that goes with that. And the formula we chose in the end was to make sure we had 3 international NGOs represented on the HCT and 3 national NGOs, and then that also meant that we reduced the UN engagement to the equivalent number, so there was parity, and then maintained observers. So the streamlining was extremely important, and then in terms of the way we tried to look at the clusters was that we've also been engaged in a sort of cluster review, looking at what clusters could be merged and the streamlining of the cluster system as well. Then finally bringing the two together by setting up a structure where one every 3 weeks, well, we have HCT meetings in one form or another every 3 weeks. One is just the core HCT without the clusters, and the other is a broader meeting of the HCT and the clusters together, where we work through the sort of operational challenges that we're addressing. So it's been a mixture of a sort of streamlining and review process, and I'm sorry to have to talk about processes, but also very much with the idea that both structures have more authority and are working within their own areas of competence. And finally, just to say, you know, we've also, in streamlining, looked at things like making sure that on the cluster side, those areas that are probably better dealt with by government or more appropriately handed over to government move there as they become more development issues, and retain their far excuse me, stronger humanitarian focus for the clusters themselves. Sorry, over to you.
Thank you, Mark, for that. Maybe just to follow up a bit, through this reform process, I assume that what you'll be looking for is ensuring that the clusters and the interclusters are better supported and given more guidance and direction to fulfill their core functions. And I maybe just want to talk a moment about the core function of the clusters in terms of supporting the HC and the HCT strategic decision making. In particular, their responsibilities for needs assessment and needs analysis, and the importance of this work in the formulation of a strategy for a country. Is there anything specific you can tell us about your experiences in Afghanistan to date, and any advice that you may be able to give to some of our participants on the phone today to ensure that clusters are better supported to fulfill their core functions?
Well, I think part of it came, in our case, through the better development of the HRP and ensuring that the HRP was more needs focused, and then tasking on that was a lot easier. The clusters had a clearer role to play in the development of the HRP. So I think that was one area, and I think OCHA provided a lot of very helpful support in this, in developing an HRP. I mean, my experience over many years with CAPS and CHAPS has been the challenge facing the HC has been to stop these being a wish list and an additional opportunity for everybody to get their sort of clear interests expressed in an overall document. So getting the framework of the HRP right and more focused on needs and costing those needs out, I think has been a major change. I say that as a former skeptic of the new approach. So that's one thing that I think has worked well in Afghanistan. We also have had help, I think, from the CHF. We have a common humanitarian fund here, and we put a proportion, not a lot of money, but we have put money into data gathering and data management as well. So we have real problems in Afghanistan with the quality of nutrition data, and we've used the CHF to have ACF as one of the agencies providing background survey and analysis work and bringing that together. So, you know, I mean, think creatively about the resources that you have at hand to to strengthen data gathering and use the appeal process far more effectively to get a narrow and focused approach.
Thanks very much. And before you run off, Mark, maybe just one final question before we move to the other panelists. Experience shows that accountability is a major problem in the field. So what are some of the accountability mechanisms that exist between the HCT and the Intercluster Coordination Group that you would like to see emphasized or expanded? And maybe just before you leave us, any final tips that you would give to humanitarian coordinators that may be listening in on how they can improve the coordination architecture in the country to achieve better outcomes?
Okay, I mean, I think on the accountability, there is a sort of monitoring framework in the HRP that provides some accountability. I have to say one of the issues that I think the accountability throws up is the relationship that the clusters have with the HC, and they're in previous places I've been, there's sometimes been a challenge as to whether the cluster coordinators cluster leads are responsible to the head of the agency they come from, and what links they have to the HC. I certainly think they need to have a dotted line in terms of at least accountability to the HC, and not looking for day-to-day management responsibilities, far from it. But I think that the cluster leads do need to have some responsibility to the humanitarian system as embodied through the HC. So that's one issue I would highlight. The other question, Laurie, you were asking was tips on.
Well, I think that humanitarian coordinators in similar situations would be interested having to hear a little bit more about your experience in Somalia and in Afghanistan. What suggestions could you provide? I mean, you've given us one just now on what measures they may take to improve the functioning of the HCT and the intercluster group. Well,
I think you have to develop at least some technical understanding of the various challenges faced in clusters, to know, in a sense, what a good or badly run refugee camp looks like. I think you have to know, enough to make sense of, the nutrition issues. I mean, I think you have to have at least a passing knowledge of some of the dynamics of what creates a humanitarian crisis in that, so that you can make the HCs accountable. And I suppose part of that, is changing by the way HCs are recruited, and also perhaps some of the training that HCs are getting. But to me, you've got to move from a sort of philosophical grasp of humanitarian issues to some of the practical nuts and bolts of what makes good operations. And I think there also it's learning from your colleagues in agencies, funds and programs.
Thanks very much. And maybe one quick question from a participant before you head off. It's a bit of a provocative question, but is it necessary to have both HCTs and intercluster coordination groups? The question is that the HCT is essential as it sets the context or content for the strategy, but is it now not the time to restructure the intercluster coordination group, have a more simple integrated committee rather than siloed clusters? So that's the question on the table. Is it time to get rid of the intercluster and focus on something else?
Well, I think it raises the whole issue of the way that clusters function, and as you mentioned earlier, was involved in my days in OCHA in the policy branch in looking at the whole development of clusters. What we originally envisaged was something very different from what we now have. What we envisaged was actually a far more of a gap-filling process, and potentially, and something also that focused far more on building up areas of competence and expertise in specific crises, not part of an institutional structure. So, I think there may be some thought given to what the core purposes of the clusters are, and whether there is a need for clusters in all the areas that we now have them. So I'm avoiding the question by throwing it back at you that way.
Thank you very much, Mark, for joining us today. Let me go over to Cyril Ferran now of the Food Security Cluster, the Global Coordinator. And let me ask you, what is your perspective of the importance of the linkage between the HCT and the ICC? And in your experience, how are these groups working together?
I think I will start saying that clusters and the intercluster group is the operational arm of the HCT. So it's the one really with operationalizing strategy that are being set or agreed upon at the HCT level. This includes needs assessment, obviously the HPC, including HNO, SRP, contingency planning, but also, as Mark was saying, also the CHF or the ERF. So I think that these are the core element or the core topics that the cluster would be looking at. Now, obviously, for having effective aid, it requires a strong HCT, but it also requires a strong intercluster group and strong cluster coordinators all together. This is not very often the reality. The reality check when you start looking at what happens, you will certainly realize that we have different possible scenarios, and very often it just takes 10 minutes to read through the HCT meetings minutes and the ICCG or ICG minutes meeting to realize that the two are not really working together. For example, when I've seen a number of countries, I will not name any countries here, but I've seen that from various countries, that the agenda of the HCT is very similar to the agenda of the intercluster group, which obviously raised the question on what the difference is, and obviously this leads to a certain level of confusion. We have also seen that the two groups are working completely independently, and the topics that are being discussed in one group at the HCT level are not at all the topics that are discussed at the ICCG level. And again, I'm strongly believing that the intercluster group is the operational arm of the HCT. So in theory, a number of strategic decisions and action points that are taken at the HCT level should basically be followed by action and discussion at the intercluster group. And very often we realize that this line is broken. So the two groups are not really talking together. And we will come probably a bit later on in the discussion into the interconnection between the two groups and the role of the humanitarian coordinator, the role also of the cluster lead agencies to make sure, and OCHA, to make sure that this link is established. Now, some good examples from my last posting, in fact, before joining the Global Food Security Cluster, was in Palestine, where the whole advocacy strategy of the HCT and the messages of the humanitarian coordinator was definitely tailored by the intercluster group. The intercluster group was the one that was debating, brainstorming, masterminding a number of ideas elaborated or extrapolated from ground reality to frame a core of advocacy messages that at the end of the day the HCT would endorse, but definitely the link was established. And I think it's a very good practice given, of course, the one of the functions of the humanitarian coordinator being on advocacy. Similarly, I think that Mark was talking about the operational challenges and problems that partners, NGOs, UN agencies are facing in the field. I think that if the ICC and the HCT are working close enough to each other, then the humanitarian coordinator and the HCT at large could certainly help to overcome some of the problems that the humanitarian workers and actors are facing, either it's related to resource mobilization, sometimes access to beneficiaries, in other time relationship with local authorities. When this connection is strongly established, then you have a humanitarian coordinator who is really in the driving seat, fully empowered, and being able really to speak on behalf of the wide humanitarian community to the benefit of affected communities altogether. So these are again some examples of indicators where things are not working well, and some examples of countries where the humanitarian coordinator was really empowered by the intercluster working group, because at the end of the day, that's what is required, is the ICC from the ground reality, from the discussion at NGO level with local partners, with beneficiaries also, to fully empower the HCD and the HC to take the right decision. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Cyril. I'd like to now go to William Shamali of the Danish Refugee Council and ask you, from an NGO perspective, what is the impact when the intercluster coordination group is not functioning as it should, or the HCT, or the two groups are not linked well together, for the operational agencies that are providing assistance on the ground? What's the impact when these two groups are not functioning as they ought to be?
Thank you, Laurie. Well, we do have a problem of perception and practice around the ICC and the HCTs. Without quoting specific surveys or conducting a fully comprehensive one, I would say that on average, both bodies are not fully trusted bodies, especially by civil societies at large. Now, the opportunity that is there is, how do we make all humanitarian partners on the ground do trust the direction where the operation is going, and hence allow an opportunity to have the action more synchronized and going in the right direction. What we've observed in several operations is, in situations where there is an actual functioning link between the operational arm, as Cyril calls it, and the policy advocacy strategy arm, that is the HCT, then that reflects better on both bodies. It kind of shapes the agenda of both bodies and make them more efficient through a stronger link between them. Now, how does that impact in practice? And my overall point there is trust in the operational leadership and the strategic direction and objectives. In situations where you don't have trust, especially at the ICC level, then NGOs or frontline actors would send not their senior staff, not their staff who can make decisions to these bodies, hence making these bodies transform to more information sharing bodies, losing efficiency, and then becoming less and less interesting, so less and less senior staff go there. So we have this vicious circle where the lack of trust in this operating body leads to less efficient bodies, while if we spin it in the other direction and we get more and more senior people and people who want to make it work, then it becomes good. Practically, what does it mean to have an efficient link between the two? Well, it's quite simple. If we take situations like humanitarian access in conflict zones, if the cluster members are negotiating access using strategies and approaches that are not communicated and not consistent with the way the humanitarian country team is negotiating access at the capital level and at the areas level, then you have a total clash and miscommunication from bodies that are perceived by the government or other groups to be the same while we're sending conflicting messaging, which eventually would reduce our capacity to operate and have access. Another example is normal resource coverage in the different areas. The less we have a proper link between the operational arm and the kind of strategic arm, the greater is the opportunity that we have left out areas where one actor is operating, unable to communicate the needs in a specific area to the ICC, which doesn't reach the HCT and hence is not prioritized. And then you risk not reaching population that otherwise would be reachable if the link was there. But we have seen several situations where the link got stronger because of specific practices, and I've got 4 that comes out really clearly. One is by having the humanitarian coordinator be involved in the inter-cluster coordination. It doesn't mean that the HC need to attend all the meetings, but it means that the discussion that is being held at the ICC level shouldn't be totally different from the one held at the HCT level. We've seen situations where the first encounter where the HC came to an ICC meeting and presented a totally different view from the discussion and reality that the ICC is witnessing created more friction and clashes and lack of trust, and it required real follow-up to fill this gap. So I think that one important practice is actual personal involvement of the HC in intercluster coordination, either meetings or indirect linkage. And I think that the growing trend of having deputy humanitarian coordinators is an opportunity to have these individuals having more time to be involved and create better linkages at this front. And it's not a one-way liaison in this sense. It's not only up to the HC to come to the ICC, but also it is of great importance to have cluster coordinators and not their representative from the OCHA office. The actual cluster coordinators attend the HCT meeting and make their points and share information in a way that shakes a bit the status quo or the perception if it is totally off reality on the HCT ground. And this doesn't need to happen only in the formal meetings. It can actually happen in parallel. It can happen over the usual coffees and beers and teas that happen. It is very important that there is a direct link between the humanitarian leadership individuals and the cluster leads as individuals. And another important point is the subnational level. Here, where the bottom line of impact of a good link happen. Even in situations where we have a good link between the ICC at the capital level with the HCT, this good link cannot be translated to better delivery on the front line unless it trickles down to the subnational level. And here we highly encourage having HCs, deputy HCs, attending meeting at the subnational levels. And this could lead to feeding into the national strategy by real discussions happening on the front line, but as well real support from the capitals to real challenges faced at the subnational level. I stop here, Laurie, on this.
Thank you very much. I would like to follow up on your last point about the relationship between national and subnational coordination mechanisms and go back to our colleagues in Kabul, Kathy Howard, and if you could explain to us a little bit how you're tackling the issue of subnational coordination in Afghanistan. We've seen in some contexts now that there's a move away from intercluster coordination groups at a subnational level, focusing instead on area HCTs, what advice do you have for participants in today's teleconference on how to improve those linkages between subnational and national structures? Kathy?
Lovely. Thank you very much, Laurie. No, indeed, it often can be the weak link, that's for sure. And it's a great shame that it is the weak link, because we do need to work to actually reversing that. If we're looking at the sort of the principle of a needs-based approach, if we're looking at improved accountability to the communities we're here to serve, the closer we are in the field to the people we're here to serve, obviously that is going to make for a much more strengthened response. So if the coordination structures at the field level are not what they should be, that is going to impact on the response. I think it's we often sort of indeed, you know, think that when you're in the capital or in Geneva, New York, you think that the field is the if you like Kabul. It's not. And when we're in Kabul, we think that the field is the state or the provincial capitals. In a way, it's not. It drills down further to district level and beyond. But realistically, we also have to look at our capacity to actually realize useful structures. So probably for us here in Afghanistan, it's trying to strengthen the coordination structure at the regional capital level. Now, in that sense, again, looking at who are our partners and who can drive on this. And clearly it is the NGOs. And I do sort of stress very much, I mean, when we talk about cluster coordination, we often talk about the cluster coordinators. Let's not forget the co-coordinators, the NGO perspective. And that becomes more and more the reality when we're looking at field coordination structures. Certainly some of the challenges for Afghanistan is that, and Mark mentioned it earlier on, there's some 1,200 NGOs registered in Afghanistan, but if you actually look at who is doing what where and who is actually able to deliver on humanitarian action in, for instance, the conflict affected parts of Afghanistan, the contested areas, then that 1,200 starts shrinking considerably down to maybe 100 partners plus, if we're lucky, if we're very lucky. You know, there is quite a disconnect in terms of the needs and the level of needs of the field versus the humanitarian footprint of NGOs and UN alike. So that inevitably is a challenge. However, our NGOs do have greater reach. They often have a longer history. They have often managed to gain more acceptance, negotiate their access, and it's really through the NGO partners that we can build on a stronger coordination structure at the regional level. So I think there's not a one size that fits all. You know, for any particular context, but certainly I think it is about identifying those. We are looking indeed at in Afghanistan at more sort of flexible, lighter models of coordination in the field. With OPCHA, of course, present in most of the fields. I think what we have to be sort of cognizant of, though, that is we don't look at a sort of a blueprint model for humanitarian coordination, but that we focus on strengthening the coordination in the areas where we have to deliver the most. So that's probably all I have to say on that for now. Back to you, Laurie.
Thank you. Okay, thanks very much, Kathy. I'd just like to follow up with Cyril now and speak a little bit about the importance of linkages with government and the need for the HCT and the intercluster coordination groups not to operate as separate entities, but really really operate in support of the government. And can you share examples of where that's working well, and what is it that we still need to fix? Cyril?
Yes, Laurie, I think I've lost you a little bit on the quality of the sound, but I mean you are asking about the linkage with the government. That's correct? Yes,
about the government's role. Yes.
Well, I think from the very beginning, Philippines, for example, is one of the examples where the linkage with the government didn't start extremely well from the beginning, in the sense that the humanitarian community set up coordination system, activated clusters, declared L3 level, but the government, who was having some capacities, was not necessarily fully consulted, for example, on some of the processes. What I think is missing in this particular instance is really the consultation with the government and look at strategically what the added value of the cluster is. If you look at the transformative agenda, it's clearly stating that clusters should be activated more strategically for a limited period of time. And unfortunately, that's not the reality. What I think is required in this case is really to look at the capacity of the government to respond to a crisis. Either they are overwhelmed or overburdened by the crisis. And I think Malawi, the response to the flood in Malawi gave us a bit of an indication of a situation where the government said, you are welcome to give us support, but you know what, we are activating our own coordination setup that they call cluster as well, and provide your support, but we are in the driving seat. So I think there has been a consultation in Malawi that is definitely the way forward. And the lack of consultation with the government, or the lack of identification of what are the triggers, what are the indicators that should decide or help deciding on the activation of the cluster or not, are the same triggers that should be used to decide on the deactivation. And I think that, again, this is not happening, and we are ending up with clusters in protracted crises that are never being shut down, or coordination never handed over to government. So I think that from the very beginning of a crisis, we should engage with the government. The government is having strategies. Let's not forget that often the government doesn't make differentiation between humanitarian and development. They have a country strategy altogether, which is the economic growth of the country that encompasses shocks that require humanitarian intervention, but the overall objective is their development path. So they have their strategies. We don't consult enough with them. And I think that in countries where this is working, we clearly understand, we clearly see that the clusters are really a support to the government, that is not a parallel coordination system, but a real support to the government, and is feeding into the priorities of the government. We are in the past, I would say, when there was the old-fashioned cap and the project profile being included, the government was often involved in the vetting process of some of the projects. Do the project meet the priorities set by the government or set by the humanitarian community as a whole? This has somehow not been fully recaptured with the new HPC process, and I think it's an area where we need really to look into in future. So I really think the government should be in the driving seat. We don't empower them enough, unfortunately, and we are ending up, as I said, having very often clusters which are becoming redundant, or which are there and don't necessarily even put the government in front of their responsibilities, because when the cluster is activated for 6, 7, 8, sometimes up to 10 years, then you are really wondering if it's really a support to the government or not. And I think not, frankly speaking, but it's because we didn't establish from the very beginning criteria to activate and deactivate, and we don't consult with the government on conditionalities for the deactivation. Over to you.
Thank you, Cyril. Yeah, thanks very much. And to follow up on this, part of the transformative agenda was a request to country teams to undertake an annual coordination architecture review to look at whether or not the clusters are functioning as they should, whether it's time to transition out some of the clusters, merge, etc. In your experience, are countries doing this as they are meant to do through the transformative agenda, or is this something that still is a bit of a gap that HCs and HCTs need to take up on a more regular basis?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Laurie. I would start saying that the way we are framing the discussion and the question as well is really looking at clusters are almost separate entities. And I think that when we do, for example, the cluster performance monitoring, we are not short of processes and systems which are in theory meant to make the humanitarian community, the clusters, the HCT more accountable. But I think that we are failing in that. I think that by developing more processes, heavy processes, we are losing a bit sometimes of the substance and the accountability dimension on what we are doing, particularly to the affected communities. I think that what we are failing to do is to consider really that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, in the sense that the ICC or the clusters, you can, when you do the monitoring of the clusters separately, you may consider that they are working and they are fulfilling their basic functions. But I still believe that aid effectiveness will be at stake as long as we are not able to really deliver more as one. And what is quite interesting is that on the development side, I mean, we're talking about the one UN for a long period of time. You would realize that there are integrated projects on the development side, such as the Millennium Development Goal Program, the Human Security Trust Fund, which are very much development-oriented programs and are integrating different organizations with different set of skills. We are still failing to achieve that, I think, at the humanitarian level. And I think that the HPC together just gives us the illusion that we are integrated, fully integrated, where in fact we are still failing to program and to implement programs, more than programming. We are failing to implement programs jointly. So as I said, the performance monitoring tool might give you the illusion that the system is working, when in fact we are not looking at the deliverable of the system in a more systematic manner. Over to you.
Thank you. Maybe just take a few points that have come from participants, a question about whether or not country teams are required to submit these annual architecture reviews to a central focal point in order to be accountable. In theory, yes, they should be on an annual basis submitting to the ERC a note that says that they have reviewed their coordination structures, they've adjusted them if it's necessary to adjust them to better meet the needs of the population, as dictated by the strategic priorities that have been laid out in their humanitarian response plan. So it is an area of work that requires a little bit more attention, I would say, in the years to come. I'd like to go back to William Shamali now and talk a little bit more about the role of NGOs in the humanitarian coordination system, and in particular when it comes to co-leading clusters and some of the challenges that NGOs are facing in the field when they do co-lead clusters, including making sure that their voices are heard at the HCT, which is typically represented by a cluster lead agency. So, William, your perspective on this, please.
Thank you, Laurie. Cyril, I just wanted to re-highlight your last point on the illusion that it's functioning. It was brilliantly said. Laurie, on your question, NGOs, I think, have a central challenge in coordination. That is, I think, the resource capacity to dedicate the right people in coordination setting. And I start by this for self-blaming or pinpointing on our own capacity to be able to actively send our most senior staff to be involved in coordination. That's rarely the case. And that's rarely the case because today, structurally, the way donors deal with coordination, the way how much coordination has become intense and process-oriented require the most senior staff we have to be very involved, staff that are able to coordinate but do have the added value, the operational added value to bring on the table. So I think the major challenge that we all have is how do we reflect this need for more lean coordination and having the right resources allocated within NGOs and UN equally, but mostly within NGOs to bring this operational input to the coordination. Now, the added value of having NGOs on the table from what we've seen, or what we try to really push when we are co-leading a cluster, which we do in several operations around the world, is basically feeding into strategic direction and planning from an actor that is on the ground and is able to react to the needs almost immediately. And this is very important when you do have in the clusters actors who are in the villages, on the front line and on the borders, who are able and have the flexibility and agility to reshape their program depending on the needs. That has a tremendous impact on the actual discussion in the cluster because it makes it more operational, it makes it more sharp, more focused, and no longer theoretical. And I think the more NGOs are present in these clusters and in the ICC, the better there are the chances to have the right discussion. Now, how does this go to the ICC and then to the HCT? A key challenge we have seen in several operations is a bit this elitism or creation of cliques and groups who have this who are privy to this access to the HCT. Very good practices that we've seen is having a separate coordination fora for NGOs who decide on how the presentation will have to be done. It doesn't always work, but it has good rate of success. And what is also important is everything related to a parallel process, to the informal influencing that happens outside the meetings, but NGOs do have direct links and direct relationship with cluster leads agencies, individuals who sit on the HCTs or the ICCs, but also the humanitarian coordinator. And we need to look at this as part of the coordination. It sometimes gains a kind of negative connotation of parallel systems. It is not. It is kind of an efficient way to use the formal processes and meetings where NGOs should be sitting, but also create an atmosphere that is backing up and supporting what the cluster coordinator is putting forward. Another important aspect of NGOs participating is to have the capacity of challenging the HCT processes and the ICC processes. NGOs tend to be a bit provocative, a bit challenging the status quo, and sometimes it's annoying, sometimes it's not. The value added of it is it's having individuals sitting in meetings that are putting pressure on everyone to re-question and reshape the way things are done and put pressure for more efficiency and pressure for more evidence-based and delivery point-focused discussions. And this is very important. And finally, I think one of the things that NGOs benefit from a lot is proper sequencing of the relationship between the ICCs and the HCTs. In situations where you have the agendas of the ICCs prepared well in advance, and NGOs can input to these with evidence and information and suggested action that can trickle to the agenda of an HCT and result in a strategic decision or complementary advocacy or complementary fundraising. This sequencing, when we get it right, make NGOs able, with limited resources, influence a lot of the discussions that are happening, but also feel the trust in the process where there is a proper sequencing to adopt views or at least seriously consider views of NGOs.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take a few questions now from participants. Maybe we'll go back to Kabul now. There's a question here about the lessons that we're learning now about effective coordination. How can we ensure that these also apply in purely refugee crises? So, Kathy, any views on that?
I'm sorry, Laurie, the line is very bad. Can you repeat the question again, please?
I'm sorry, the line is bad from Geneva. This morning it was Kabul, but Geneva, there's no excuse. Can you hear me better now?
Yes, much better.
Okay. So the question from one of today's participants is about the lessons that we're learning about effective coordination between the HCT and the intercluster coordination group. How can we ensure that these lessons learned are being applied also in pure refugee crises?
Okay, thank you for that question, Laurie, and it's indeed quite in a way quite a provocative question as well. I mean, without going into the complexities around the sort of the working in refugee crises, whether they be in purely refugee crises or mixed settings, clearly, I mean, if I look at the Afghanistan situation, where we have, for instance, here a refugee influx from Pakistan, in quite a very porous border situation, and in this setting where there is also host communities very much impacted also by the refugee influx. Still, we see, of course, under the leadership of HCR, and that is, of course, the leadership of HCR in this setting, very good coordination. That is indeed through the multi-sector, but it is clearly a strong leadership by HCR. We have seen it's a privilege to have also a relationship with OCHA and with the clusters, whereby we can ensure that there is support provided also by clusters where required in support of, for instance, host communities impacted by, and also to ensure that there is also the ongoing coordination structures in the region for other events such as further internal displacement or flooding or natural disasters. So I think in terms of sort of the lessons to be learned, what we need, and we have in Afghanistan, is through the HCT. We have UNHCR represented as one of the lead agencies, one of the 6 UN agencies on the HCT. They're there because they have cluster lead responsibilities for protection, for shelter, for NFIs, but also there, of course, in their role as mandated for refugees. So there is a strong link there. Probably where we see it a little bit less strong is at the ICCT level, and there are some challenges around that. We're in the process of trying to revitalize the multi-sector to ensure that the refugees and returnees are fully integrated but have a good seat at the table within the ICCT, because I think there's also, of course, a lot that can be shared and learned from the experiences of the clusters and their technical expertise, and then certain sort of that can be shared with the multi-sector. certainly, I think one of the very good examples of how we can ensure improved coordination within a refugee response is when we also look at resource mobilization. That is a great strength, of course, of an HCT, which is able to put its weight behind resource mobilization, establishing of the priorities of for humanitarian action, and also, of course, the use of whether it be CHF funding or the activation of SURF funding to support whatever emergency does come, whether that be a refugee emergency or elsewhere. So it is about the strength, I think, of the architecture system to support the refugee response is also about ensuring that there are agreed upon priorities vis-a-vis the host of other priorities and humanitarian needs, and that everyone adheres to those priorities. Particularly when it comes to the provision of mobilizing of resources. And that, of course, is very much the role of the humanitarian coordinator. While OCHA has a strong role with the clusters on resource mobilization with clusters, HCR does have its responsibilities for its own resource mobilization, but ultimately that does come under the overall country humanitarian strategy as set by the HC. So I think that's an area where we can ensure a closer collaboration and collegiality.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you very much for that, Kathy. Before we move on to some of the other questions that are coming our way, I'd like to give William Shamali the floor for a few moments just to respond also to this question. Okay.
Yeah, I guess it's a great question. I would like to tap on one key element for the civil societies. The cluster system has created a systematic way that sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't, but a way where we can push for NGOs and civil society, including national NGOs, to actively influence national strategies. There is a possibility, a channel, and a clear, legitimate, recognized process where we can actually push and lobby and provide evidence to influence national strategies. This is an area where I think the refugee coordination can benefit a lot from, to open up strategies influence for refugee coordination in countries where you only have refugees. I'm not talking about mixed situations. I'll come to that point in a moment. To take that, and UNHCR has recognized this, and over the last 6 months there has been tremendous high-level progress on this front between Amos and Guterres on UNHCR developed coordination and practice that opens up this capacity for civil society to influence, and the paper on coordination and practice. However, the reality on the ground in mixed situations is proving very difficult and complex, especially at the ICC, at the intercluster coordination level. And I take the non-typical example of Iraq, recognizing the limitations of this example. The capacity of coordinating both refugee response and IDP response and host communities through the cluster system has not been working for several months. And we have seen several challenges in duplication of meetings, duplications of decisions, etc., that needs to be addressed. And this brings our discussion here becomes very relevant, because the opportunity of fixing this duplication is exactly in creating a strong link between the right discussion to happen at the ICC level and bringing it at the HCT level. However, there is real differences between refugees and IDPs. From what we're seeing in Iraq, the government counterparts are different. The legal frameworks are different. The right to work for IDPs is very different than the right to work for refugees. The government responsibility is different. So what you can push and advocate with the government for is very different between IDPs and refugees. So even though a stronger link between ICC and HCTs may make the operation smoother for the two group of population, we still think that there is operational realities where, again, the subnational coordination level is the only operational practical body that can crack how to deal with it from village to village, from delivery point to delivery point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to now go on to a few of the questions we're receiving regarding the role of the cluster lead agency and the importance of that function in the humanitarian country team to represent the views of the clusters, to raise issues that the clusters have with the HCT, and how we are seeing in several contexts that this is not really working as it should. So, Cyril, let me perhaps go to you first. How can we fix this disconnect that some see between the cluster lead agency, its responsibilities to the clusters, and its participation in the HCT?
Thank you, Laurie. Well, that's a very, very important point, and that's exactly what I was saying earlier on the link on how the cluster are linked to the HCT altogether. And by definition or in theory, the cluster lead agencies or the head of agencies of the cluster lead agencies are accountable to the humanitarian coordinator, and at the HCT level, they are reporting on the affairs related to the cluster. But it's very, very hard to have this established properly. We don't have in all countries the representative who dedicate enough of their time or sufficient time to the cluster. I've been witnessing a number of countries, not only for food security, but other clusters as well. There is a lack of briefing, so the cluster coordinator doesn't have a lot of opportunities to brief the head of agency, of the cluster lead agency. Very often the head of agency will forget that the cluster coordinator doesn't represent the cluster lead agency, but represent a group of humanitarian partners, national, international NGOs, and is basically the voice of all these group of actors which are operating under a given cluster. So there is this lack of understanding in a number of instances. I think that what we are trying to do in food security now is making sure that the representatives of co-lead agencies, because food security is co-led, making sure that the head of agencies are properly briefed prior to deployment or redeployment, that they are briefed about what the cluster is, what their function is, and that when they are at the HCT, they have to represent both interests. So their agency's interests, but also being the cluster voice. If this is the case, then we are fine, and we are almost sure that the different actors are properly represented. If it is not the case, then that's where we say that it's better that the cluster coordinator is also participating in the HCT to make sure that this broader views of the partners is represented. But I really think that there is still work to be done, and this was recently highlighted in the food security cluster evaluation that reviewed the past 4 years of food security coordination, highlighting that there is still some work to be done for securing the buy-in from co-lead agencies and the representatives. So there is a bit of sometimes a misunderstanding or lack of understanding, at least, to what their function is when they are attending the HCT, that it's not only about their agency but also representing the cluster. So I think the way forward is really making sure that they are briefed properly, then making sure that there are regular meetings that are taking place between the cluster lead agency and the cluster coordinator, and it's both ways. The cluster coordinator needs to be briefed by the head of agency on what is being discussed at the HCT, and vice versa. The cluster coordinator needs to brief the lead agency on what is being discussed at the intercluster group level to make sure that the proper decision and reflection are taking place in both groups. So the link, I would certainly say that the link between the ICT and the HCT is or should be less OCHA than the cluster lead agencies or the cluster coordinators themselves. But the precondition for that to be a reality is really in making sure that the cluster coordinator and the head of agency are regularly meeting. Over to you.
Thanks very much. And maybe just to follow up with a comment from one of the participants who's referring to one of the complex emergencies in Africa, writing that the humanitarian coordinator has been reluctant to have cluster coordinators participate even as mere observers in the HCT. So maybe over to you, Kathy. You're trying to address this problem in Afghanistan. What advice can you give to cluster coordinators in the field who are facing a problem of representation in the HCT, or conversely to HCT members that would like to help an HC overcome his or her reluctance to seek these linkages, stronger linkages between the two groups?
Great. Okay. Indeed, I think there's indeed many different examples on this. I think that the guidance is quite clear from the IASC in terms of what is needed in the relationship between the clusters, so the cluster coordinators and the HCT. This really has to be seen as a common aim, a common objective, a social contract, if you like, between the cluster coordinators and the co-coordinators. I keep on stressing the role of co-coordinators. Let's not forget them in this. And the HCT, and ultimately the HC. It is really somewhat incomprehensible to think that the one can be functioning without real representation from the clusters. We talk about the clusters being the ICCT or the Intercluster Working Group being the engine room of operations, and it certainly needs to be empowered and strengthened and have its voice heard. I think there's, the role of the HC is absolutely crucial in this, in setting the tone of the kind of partnerships to be established. And I think indeed, if any cluster is finding it hard to get representation, a frank a meeting with the HC may be supported also by the cluster lead agency is certainly would be necessary. I think we have to sort of also, when we look at the representation of the clusters at the HCT here in Afghanistan, as Mark outlined earlier, we have now introduced a system whereby we have a 3-week rotational meeting with either the core HCT or then every other 3rd week the core HCT meeting with the clusters, and that is the cluster lead and the co-leads, jointly in the room. But let's also not, when we think about how to improve the sort of the representation of, I think we need to be also not just thinking, well, that would be enough. What we're very conscious of in Afghanistan is we have a system of on the HCT that we have also NGO representation, just as cluster lead agencies should be representing not only their own agency interests, but that of the clusters, that of the broader community. So should the NGO representatives on the HCT be representing the NGO community. It's not always the case. We're putting actually a lot of effort here in Afghanistan into other fora where the HC and OCHA meets with a much broader spectrum of NGOs than are represented only through the HCT or, for that matter, through the co-leads of the clusters. And it's precisely to try and ensure that we're keeping much more, getting a sense of what the community is wanting, what the community, the humanitarian community, and by this I mean the NGOs, is also wanting of the HC, of the HCT, and also of the intercluster working group. Yeah, in terms of advice, I think, yeah, you know, you need to speak up. If you're not being heard, if you're not being represented effectively at the HCT, or there's enough space for you, speak out, because it really is absolutely essential for the whole system that cluster coordinators and co-coordinators are part of the HCT in some form.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Maybe just a comment that I'll read from one of the participants that says, the HCT attending ICC and the cluster coordinators attending HCT meetings, isn't this too much overlapping and repetition of meetings? So a bit of a call for us to be conscious of the amount of time that's required for coordination and to make sure that it's being streamlined. I would like to take a question that I would address to William Shamali. And it has to do with NGO representation on the HCT. We've talked a lot about the need for NGOs to be represented as co-leads in the intercluster and to co-lead clusters. But what about the representation on the HCT? It's not necessarily the case that always the NGO representation on the HCT represents the wider NGO community. So how are we making sure that the voice and the concerns of NGOs are really being addressed in the HCT? William?
Thank you. Yes, it's a very interesting question. It's like asking UNICEF to represent the wider UN community, or WSP to represent the wider UN community. It always boils down to the NGOs to represent the wider community. I don't think that's the added value of having an NGO on the HCT. The real added value from our perspective is to have an operational actor who is on the front line to bring first-hand information and try to put pressure on everyone by bringing the reality to the table and bringing information that is qualitative enough without being washed out through consensus building, quantitative data, etc., to become part of the discussion. And honestly, most of the HCTs today do have NGOs around the table, around the world, at least international NGOs. And many of them have NGOs elected by a group of NGOs to be presented. Does that mean that these NGOs are representing the wider community? I don't think so. I think basically what it means is to bring this operational angle, but where NGOs need to focus is to create this information stream in a meaningful way. So representatives do listen to other NGOs concerned, make sure to present them when possible and when there are opportunities, but also most importantly to bring back the discussion to the NGO fora and say, okay, this is where the discussion is going, and if 90 NGOs disagree, then they have to make the noise and make their point, and that doesn't only have to be through one NGO representative on the HCT. Yeah, in short, I think where we need to focus is not on the representational value, but on the type of representation that is around the table, and that's actually a frontline operational body that is trying to sharpen the discussion all the time and bring field reality to the capital.
you very much. We started today's conversation noting that our operational peer reviews have demonstrated that there is a lack of effective linkages between the HCT and the Intercluster Coordination Group. I'd like to end today's discussion on another reflection from these operational peer reviews, and that is one that seems to be demonstrating that neither the HCT nor the Intercluster Coordination Group is proving to be very effective in terms of accountability to affected people, that we are not seeing countries put in place the appropriate mechanisms, whether it's communicating with communities, whether it's feedback mechanisms, that is actually demonstrating that we are being accountable to the people living in crisis situations. So I'd like to go to you, Cyril, and ask you, what is it that both HCTs and the intercluster should do jointly as well as individually to make sure that we can be more accountable to the people in the humanitarian crisis settings where we are working?
I think, Laurie, you named it. But one is that I think that there is a lack of trained and skilled people on what accountability to affected population means, what it entails, and what the different options are. So I think that we are lacking, or the cluster coordinators are lacking sometimes some of the expertise to mainstream that, or to make sure that this is becoming a reality. And William was saying that a bit earlier, is that we are lacking seniority of cluster coordinators very often to lead that discussion. The cluster coordinator's function is difficult. Well, it's difficult to find good cluster coordinators that are coming from agencies with the seniority, with the diversity of background and experience. So this is proven very difficult. It's difficult to finance the clusters at country level. Therefore, we have a very high turnover of staff. And maintaining an agenda such as accountability to affected population requires really dedicated people with the skill. Very often, the skill is lost as the person is moving on. And I'm afraid that's too often a reality. So we need to make the effort that the pool of cluster coordinators that are deployed in the field are receiving the proper background and training, and that's required. Again, it's not a single agency or a single cluster task. It's really a collective effort that we must ensure, and probably OCHA is having some role to play in that, I would say, on training in particular. I've seen in Iraq the effort of making sure that communication with communities is becoming a reality. And I think that's a good example, but again, it's because there was a conjunction of factors there. On the food security side, we had a cluster coordinator who was coming with this background, and on the OCHA side, there was the expertise also embedded within OCHA. So altogether, that has gained some momentum in Iraq. But as I said, it's not a unique case, but it's too ad hoc, and it depends very much on the profile of people we are facing. So not to take too long, because we are reaching almost the end of the webinar. I really think that what is lacking at the moment is really the skills. The cluster coordinators have to be properly trained, and the cluster lead agencies and the global clusters have also to be able to overcome this high rotation level of staff where we are losing momentum and expertise, I would say, almost every 3 to 6 months. Over to you.
Thanks very much. I'm just reading some of the chat in which we're reminded that there's not a lot of people with expertise available to support accountability efforts in the field. But another comment, maybe we are getting ahead of ourselves talking about accountability to communities when we haven't quite sorted out coordination issues amongst ourselves first. So perhaps before we leave and give our panelists the final few words, I'd like to just point out that there are different resources available to country offices that do require support to review and to improve HCT and intercluster coordination collaboration. I would remind you of the IASC reference module for cluster coordination at country level. We talked about it today, the importance of having annual coordination architecture review to make sure that the coordination that is in the country is fit for purpose, that it's aligned to the strategic objectives of the humanitarian response plan. Also, the cluster coordination monitoring tool has been used in 12 countries so far. It should be used, if possible, by several clusters at once so you get an overview of how the clusters are functioning. And I would also like to remind you that the Global Cluster Coordination Group does meet regularly in Geneva. Its objective is to provide support to the field, so if you are aware that there are coordination problems, please do not hesitate to let me know or to let our team know so that we will be able to provide any technical support either remotely or in the field. We just have another few moments left. I would ask each of our panelists to very briefly, in 30 seconds, leave us with your best advice, your best tips for our country participants today on what could be done, what do you recommend being done to improve the linkages between the HCT and the Intercluster Coordination Group, starting with William Shamali.
Well, it's quite simple. The most senior people need to be at the subnational level, pushing up to the capital with real-time feedback and operational strategic observation to make coordination work. That's what will crack the distance between ICC and HCTs and will make any strong link really meaningful for delivery.
Thank you very much. Cyril, over to you.
Very briefly, I think that the humanitarian coordinators need to make the effort to go down to the cluster coordinators and meet them either at the ICC or ICG level or even in the field. And I think that having field visit with humanitarian coordinator and the visit being led by cluster coordinators and NGO partners is really a great initiative that I've been witnessing in a number of countries. So I think that it provides ground reality to the humanitarian coordinator together with the cluster coordinators and gives great motivation also to the cluster coordinators. Over to you.
Thank you, Cyril. And finally, Kathy from Kabul, a country which is undertaking a reform process right now on the HCT and intercluster. Any final tips for our audience?
Well, tips, I think it's more just to say that we need to have the right people in the right place. It's already been mentioned that needs to be strengthened at the field level. It is from the ground up. This is where the true accountability lies. And we need to get resources. We need to get predictable, regular resources for the funding of cluster coordinator and co-lead positions. Can't stress enough the importance of NGOs as co-lead NGOs in this whole process.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'd like to really thank our panelists today, Cyril, Mark Bowden, Kathy Howard, William Shamali, and I very much appreciate the time participants have taken to address your questions. I'd also like to do a little forward advertising for the state team. There are some upcoming webinars on accountability to affected people, rapid response mechanisms, and making the business case for preparedness. So for me, Laurie Heber-Girardet from OCHA, wishing you a very pleasant afternoon. Thank you for joining us.